see any of that, but there's quite a lot of information in there if you wanted to dig deeper into the process. I also make a lot of other kinds of drawings all the time. So on the left there's an example of a digital drawing, but on the right you can see a much more straightforward, tracing and drawing and just using images from elsewhere and putting them together on studio walls. So that kind of process is always important. Coming back to texts again, this text by Deleuze was also an interesting way in for me to the Proust text. I don't know if any of you've read it, but it's quite a brief text, and it's really fantastic if you're interested in ideas about time. And I came across this text by Mika Bal called Mottled Screen, Reading Proust Visually, and she picked up on a very interesting description in Proust, where the main character Marcel is reading in the garden, and he has this experience of a kind of a double state of mind. So his own internal thoughts and feelings seem to get projected somehow onto the external space of the garden in front of him, and he experiences this kind of double space, which Proust called the mottled screen. And that seemed to be a really interesting image for me. So we've talked a bit about how we might use theory and how it doesn't necessarily always or shouldn't lead the practice. But sometimes I think what happens is you're working on something in the studio and you develop an idea through practice that you then recognise somehow in a theoretical context. So when I came across this mottled screen description, I thought, well, that's what I'm trying to do in the paintings, and it leads you off into other ways of developing that practice. It plugs into it in some way. This is the last page of Proust's novel, so you can see the way in which he worked and reworked and crossed out and doubled back. So the whole sense of his practice seemed to fit as well. And in retrospect, I think my PhD was largely driven by the desire to understand Proust's project through practice. And so it helped me a lot to develop the argument of the PhD, which, as you all know, you have to do in some way. So the argument evolved in my PhD towards this definition of haptic temporality in painting, which was supported by ideas from Proust and from Deleuze. I'm just going to move on to some things that I've made since the PhD. I finished it 6 years ago. So as you can see, I'm still working with this idea of a double space, a mottled screen, and you have here a sense of an interruption of a view of a landscape with something more screen-like, which is again appropriated from other sources, film stills from Haneke's Time of the Wolf, and there's also a Bryce Marden painting here. In here, it's just kind of appearing and disappearing. So I was also starting to think a lot about the complexity of viewing roles and how the painting addresses the viewer. And so here there are two film stills from Haneke's film, one where the figure is looking away from us and one where the figure is looking at us. And that was really where I was starting to think about these conflicting moments of address. And that's something that I'm working on much more at the moment, but I won't really go into that. I then made some works that involved bringing lots of images together again, but not overlapping each other, rather shown alongside each other, and developing a kind of a frame around an empty centre of the work. This was partly connecting with notions from Deleuze, again, about percept, where he said that philosophers create concepts and artists create percepts. by which he meant a percept is it's a sort of an assemblage or an amalgam of different perceptions, and it connects with his idea of unfolding, how everything folds and unfolds in terms of multiplicity. So that was really behind these works. I made drawings and paintings, and I started to develop a use of graphite pigment made into paint, which I used on black surfaces. So they're quite difficult to photograph, but maybe you get the idea. The surface kind of changes as you move around in front of the work. They were also related to Derrida's notion of parergon, which he talked about in The Truth in Painting, which is to do with the idea of the leftover things from the main story. So the main thing being the ergon, and the things around the edge being the parergon, the ornamental or the non-necessary things. So just the last few slides, a couple of the things that I brought today. The first one is from a series that I made onto digital prints using this graphite pigment, and I was, obviously still thinking about notions of time and materiality, and maybe Bergson's ideas of his work on perception and memory, which sort of mixes together elements of duration and matter. But I was also thinking about that tradition that you get in a lot of artists' work of painting the studio. So Matisse's Red Studio, for example, you see it in the latest show in Liechtenstein show, actually, where he developed that idea in an interesting way. And so these were studio was a studio that I did a residency in Berlin. So it's a rather makeshift kind of space. It didn't have much in it, and it had this sense of this strange sort of out of time sense for me. Being there was rather surreal. So this is a close-up of it. You can maybe see there are points of colour where you get coming through from the digital print, and then this rather weighty other material coming over the top. So my recent experiments kind of continue with this idea of coexisting spaces, and here there are kind of real and fictitious spaces coming together, and artworks from various sources leaking into the space or inhabiting space. And this is partly linked to my interest at the moment in Baudelaire's idea of painting as a world. So not just something that's a kind of a view of something in the world, but it's created almost as a world, and it's more mental and geographic in that sense. And he linked that to what he called constructive imagination. So he's interested in not just the image, but the way in which it was built and constructed by the imagination. And this is the other piece that I've brought today, which is it's a sequence of 4 images painted on top of each other, so with the attempt of allowing something of each of the images to show through. So there's a film still here from Antonioni film. A lot of his films had figures with their backs to you, which does interest me, this notion of address and absorptive address in a painting. And there's also notes here from Duchamp's large glass, and various layers of time and a different source material. So that's where I am at the moment.